October 1962, Singapore. 12 American Green Berets step off a transport aircraft at RAF Changi. They have been told they are going to a training exercise. They have been told it will last 6 weeks. They have been told they will be working with British personnel on basic jungle familiarization. Every part of that briefing is a lie. What they are actually about to participate in is one of the most secretive joint operations of the early Cold War. They will spend the next 8 months fighting alongside the British Special Air Service in the jungles of Borneo. They will engage Indonesian regular army forces in firefights that the United States government will never publicly acknowledge. And they will come home with one shared opinion that will define American Special Forces doctrine for the next 20 years. This is the story of what those Green Berets said about the British SAS, and why their words still matter today. The conflict that drew them in was called the Konfrontasi. It was a war that nobody in the West paid attention to at the time, and almost nobody remembers now. In 1962, the president of Indonesia, Sukarno, decided that the new Federation of Malaysia, which was about to incorporate the British colonial territories of Sarawak and Sabah on the island of Borneo, was a colonial construction that needed to be destroyed. He began infiltrating Indonesian military units across the border into British-controlled territory. He launched raids. He sent volunteers to support communist insurgencies. He attacked British outposts. The British response was led by the Special Air Service. The SAS had been operating in Malaya during the communist emergency in the 1950s, and they had developed jungle warfare doctrine that was, by 1962, the most sophisticated in the world. They knew the terrain. They knew the people. They knew how to live in the jungle for months at a time without resupply. But they were stretched thin. The British government did not want a public war with Indonesia. They wanted the conflict managed quietly, with small units operating in deniable ways across borders that were officially closed. The SAS was the perfect instrument for this kind of war. There were not enough of them, so in 1962, an arrangement was made between the British government and the Kennedy administration. American Special Forces would be quietly attached to SAS units in Borneo. They would learn jungle warfare from the SAS. They would participate in operations, and they would do all of it under conditions of complete secrecy. The American government would deny any involvement. The British government would deny any American involvement. The Indonesians would not know that Americans were in the country at all. The 12 Green Berets who arrived in Singapore in October 1962 were the first wave. Their team leader was a captain named James Daniel Walker. Walker was 31 years old. He was a veteran of the Korean War. He had been with the 10th Special Forces Group in Germany before being selected for this mission. He was, by every account that survives him, exactly the kind of officer the Army wanted in this role. Disciplined, smart, confident. Walker had read everything the United States Army had on jungle warfare. He had studied the Pacific campaigns of World War II. He had read Marine Corps doctrine on tropical operations. He had reviewed the British experience in Malaya. He arrived in Singapore believing that he and his team were probably the best prepared American jungle operators of their generation. The first time Walker met the SAS commander he would be working with, the SAS commander offered him a cup of tea. Walker accepted. They talked for approximately 15 minutes. The SAS commander asked Walker about his background, about his training, about his expectations for the mission. Walker answered honestly. He said his team was ready to deploy and could be operational within 72 hours. The SAS commander smiled. He asked Walker if he would mind staying in Singapore for a few additional days, just to handle some administrative matters. Walker agreed. The few additional days became 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, the SAS quietly evaluated every member of the American team. They watched them in the field. They watched them in conversation. They watched them eat. They watched them sleep. They were looking for specific things. They were looking for men who could be trusted in the jungle where mistakes get killed. At the end of the evaluation, the SAS commander returned to Walker. He told Walker that his team would not be deploying. They would be going through SAS jungle training first. The training would last approximately 90 days. After that, if they passed, they would be assigned to SAS troops as supplementary operators. Walker objected. He pointed out that his men were already trained Special Forces operators. He pointed out that they had completed the Q course at Fort Bragg. He pointed out that they had jungle qualification from the school in Panama. He pointed out that delaying the deployment would compromise the operational timeline. The SAS commander listened patiently. When Walker was finished, the SAS commander said one sentence. He said, "Captain, the Q course is the best jungle training in America. It is not the best in the world." Walker reported the conversation to his superior. His superior told him to do whatever the SAS commander said. The training began the following week. The training was unlike anything the Green Berets had experienced. They were not taught skills. They were taught attitudes. The SAS instructors did not assume that the Americans needed to learn how to navigate, or how to shoot, or how to set up a patrol base. Or they assumed the Americans already knew how to do those things. What the SAS instructors wanted to teach was something different. They wanted to teach the Americans how to think. The first lesson was about silence. American military doctrine in 1962 emphasized communication. Patrols moved with a regular radio contact. Squad leaders gave verbal commands. Soldiers checked in with each other constantly. The SAS told the Americans to stop talking, to stop making noise, to stop signaling their presence in any way. The Americans found this difficult. One of the Green Berets, a sergeant named Robert Mansfield, later wrote about the experience in an unclassified memoir. He wrote that the silence was the hardest thing he had ever done. He wrote that he had not realized, until he tried to stop, how much of his identity as a soldier was built on talking. He wrote that the SAS instructors used to follow the American patrols at a distance just to count the times an American soldier made an unnecessary noise. The first patrol, the SAS counted 47 incidents. The 40th patrol, they counted 3. The second lesson was about water. American soldiers were trained to ration water carefully on long patrols to avoid running out. The SAS told them to drink as much as they wanted, whenever they wanted. The point was not to conserve water. The point was to learn the jungle well enough that you always knew where the next water would come from. This required the Americans to learn to read the terrain in a way they had never been taught. They learned to identify specific tree species that indicated underground water. They learned to identify specific bird sounds that indicated streams nearby. They learned to read the angles of slopes to predict where rainwater would collect. By the end of the second month of training, the Americans were operating with a level of environmental awareness that had simply not existed in their previous experience. They were beginning to understand what the SAS commander had meant when he said that the Q course was not the best in the world. The third lesson was about killing. This is the lesson that nobody in the American military establishment wanted to discuss when the Green Berets returned home in 1963. American doctrine, going back to the Korean War, emphasized firepower. American patrols carried heavy weapons. American patrols engaged enemies aggressively when contact was made. So American patrols believed in winning fights through superior force. The SAS taught the Americans to think about killing differently. The SAS taught that the goal of a small patrol in the jungle was not to win fights. The goal was to never be in fights at all. The goal was to see the enemy without being seen. The goal was to gather intelligence and exit before the enemy knew they had been there. And when killing was necessary, the goal was to do it quickly, quietly, and without leaving evidence. This was a different war than the Americans had been training for. It was a war of patience, of observation, of psychological discipline. It was a war where the best operators might go an entire deployment without firing a shot and would be considered more successful than operators who had achieved high enemy body counts. The Americans struggled with this. American military culture, then and now, rewards aggression. American soldiers are praised for taking risks, for closing with the enemy, for engaging decisively. The SAS rewarded the opposite. The SAS rewarded the operator who saw the enemy first and walked away. In late 1962, after 3 months of training, the American team finally deployed to Borneo. They were attached in pairs to British SAS troops. They participated in cross-border operations into Indonesian territory. They engaged Indonesian regular army units in small firefights. They observed Indonesian supply routes. They mapped Indonesian base camps for follow-on attacks. By the end of the deployment in mid-1963, every American on the team had been changed by the experience. Our Sergeant Mansfield wrote in his memoir that he had arrived in Singapore believing he was a complete soldier. He had departed Borneo believing he had not been a soldier at all. He had been an apprentice. When the team returned to the United States, they wrote a series of after-action reports. The reports were classified at the time, and most of them remained classified until the late 1990s. They are now available for research at the National Archives. The reports were uniformly critical of American doctrine. They argued that the United States Army was teaching its special forces to fight the wrong kind of war. They argued that the focus on firepower and aggression was producing operators who could not survive in environments where stealth was the only viable approach. They argued that the British SAS was, in 1962, 15 years ahead of American special forces in jungle warfare doctrine. The reports were ignored. The Green Berets returned to their previous units. The Special Forces leadership filed the reports and moved on. The lessons learned in Borneo were not incorporated into American training. American doctrine continued to emphasize firepower. American Special Forces continued to deploy with the same tactics they had been using before the joint operations with the SAS. 3 years later, the United States entered the Vietnam War. American Special Forces operators began dying in jungles that looked very much like the jungles of Borneo. They were dying at rates that the SAS had specifically warned against. They were being ambushed by enemies they could not see. They were giving away their positions through noise and movement. They were trying to win firefights against opponents who refused to fight on American terms. By 1968, the Special Forces leadership began quietly revisiting the after-action reports from the Borneo deployment. By 1970, MACVSOG had incorporated SAS-derived techniques into its standard operating procedures. By the time Charles Beckwith founded Delta Force in 1977, the entire foundational doctrine of the unit was built on principles that had originated with the British SAS and had been observed firsthand by American operators in 1962. Beckwith himself spent a year embedded with the SAS in 1962 and 1963. He was at Hereford. He participated in their selection. He passed it. He came back to the United States with the same conclusion every other American who had been with the SAS came back with. The Americans were good. The British were better, and the only way for the Americans to catch up was to copy what the British were doing. Delta Force selection today is essentially a modified version of SAS selection. The endurance march, the land navigation, the psychological screening, the board interview, all of it traces back to Hereford. All of it traces back to those first joint operations in Borneo, when 12 American Green Berets stood in a jungle and realized that everything they had been taught was incomplete. If you want to see how that lineage continues today, our channel War Code covers Delta Force selection in detail. The video on the 99% failure rate breaks down exactly which elements of SAS selection were incorporated. The link is in the description below. But the question I want to leave you with is this. Captain James Daniel Walker, the team leader who arrived in Singapore in 1962, confident that his men were the best prepared jungle operators in America, was not stupid. He was an experienced officer with multiple combat tours. He had read everything available on his subject. He had trained at the best American facilities, and he was wrong. If a man like Walker can be that wrong about that important a subject, what assumptions do we hold today that will be exposed by the next war? Tell me what you think in the comments below.